Yeah. So, feel free to ask questions and discuss with David. But I ask you because also for others to hear, but also for the people who are streaming to hear, that we use the microphone when you have a question, and also that will help to bring some organization because there's only one person who can ask a question at the same time. So, David, you have to hook up your microphone. Yeah. Need some help? Yeah. Okay, Krishna.
I have a semantic problem with that statement of can thought be aware of its own limitation? Because I think thinking is a faculty separate from the faculty of awareness. So it's a bit confusing to say can thought be aware?
Yeah.
It's a separate faculty. Perhaps he means can one be aware? Because he liked to not use the word I.
Yeah.
So instead of saying can I be aware, he says can thought be aware? But possibly he means can one be aware? Just a semantic difficulty.
No, I understand, and you may well be right. As I said, it's a statement that I myself find rather confusing, but it's challenging because for a couple of reasons. One is that, as he said, he stated outright in that dialogue, this is an essential issue. He doesn't just, touch on it briefly and pass by. He states this is an essential issue. That's one reason I have trouble with it. I mean, why I can't just, let it go. And the other thing is that even though, as you say, the actual wording that he uses gives one pause, on the other hand, he seems to be very deliberate and about insisting on that wording. He says, can thought itself realize its own limitation? He distinguishes that between, or am I telling thought, which is not the same at all. But not only in this dialogue, but in quite a few other places that I've run across, he kind of insists on that language. So, but for the very reason that you mentioned, it's hard to understand how thought can realize or be aware of anything at all, much less its own nature. And so it's a puzzling thing.
But I think David Bohm was not there. He needed David Bohm to
Yeah.
make him precise what words.
Yeah, where's Bohm when we need him at the most?
Thanks, David. You suggested that one of the central Krishnamurti principles, perhaps the Krishnamurti law, is whenever there's psychological division, there must be conflict. Could you expand a little bit more on two words in this sentence, psychological and division? Not together necessarily, but psychological as opposed to what? And division as opposed to what?
So, the distinction between what is psychological and what is not psychological comes up in a lot of contexts in the teachings. It comes up very prominently, as we touched upon, in connection with time. There's that book of dialogues between Krishnamurti and Bohm called The Ending of Time. And I would maintain that that is quite an unfortunate and rather misleading title, because if you're not very familiar with the teachings, you automatically assume that when it says the ending of time, it means time. Time means, you know, what you measure with the clock or the calendar, and so to talk about the ending of time seems rather bizarre, and it kind of contributes to the sense that Krishnamurti might be some kind of odd, mystical character who is incomprehensible. So, psychological time, he says, is a very, very different thing than ordinary physical time. And in the same way, psychological division is a very different quality than, you know, a division that you might find in nature.
Sorry to interrupt, but if you don't mind, just speak to those two terms separately rather than putting them together right now. What, in your view, is Krishnamurti's usage of the term psychological? That's a question in and of itself. Psychological as opposed to what? And division, is that a perception of a division or a illusion of a division? I'm really asking those as separate questions rather than psychological division as one term.
Yeah, I was going to try to come to that. So first, to try to round out the distinction between the physical and the psychological. Krishnamurti approaches this in a number of different ways. He talks about the inner and the outer. Sometimes he, just to use a very rough kind of rule of thumb, he talks about, you know, what is inside the skin as opposed to outside the skin. So, you know, as a first approximation, you could use that as a rough orientation towards the distinction between the psychological and everything else. But, you know, if you want to go a little bit more deeply and precisely, you have to look at thought, emotion, desire, motivation. Especially in the early teachings, Krishnamurti does not distinguish strongly between thought and emotion. He often refers to them jointly, hyphenated as thought, feeling, as if they are just one thing. Okay, so that is an essential element of the psychological field. But, you know, for Krishnamurti, the psychological field, very importantly, also includes perception, seeing, observation, insight, which is kind of another family, if you will, of psychological phenomena. And I think if you take those, for my purposes, for my understanding, if you take those two things together, on the one hand, you have the family of thought, feeling, emotion, desire, motivation, images, knowledge, time. And on the other hand, you have the family of perception, awareness, seeing, observation, insight, intelligence. Those two families, more or less, constitute the psychological field, I would say. So where division comes in is if that field, if the psychological field is inherently, in and of itself, intrinsically one, whole, undivided in its essential nature, then if a division is introduced into something that is inherently undivided, then that division, there's a falseness to it. There's an artificiality, and you're almost doing some kind of violence to something if it's inherently whole, and you introduce a division. And as I understand it, that's what Krishnamurti means by division in the psychological field, an artificial or false separation of things which are inherently indivisible.
So as I understood it, you suggested that a rough approximation of psychological is inside the skin and the rest is
Yeah.
physical, but then also inside the skin is my liver and my
Yeah,
kidney
yeah.
and my spleen
Of
and
course.
also my neurons and
Of course.
so on. So what then in the world of inside is psychological as opposed to, can you perhaps try to contrast inside the skin, if you want to use that thing, what is or are the characteristics that could be termed quote unquote psychological, and is that in opposition to possibly biological, or you wouldn't see it that way? Because the distinction of inside the skin and outside didn't help me much in appreciating this concept of psychological.
Well, please.
I think biological is factual, and in psychological there is an element of imagination. It originates from imagination, which means it includes some form of illusion, if you like. Now, the existence of illusion is a fact in human consciousness, but illusion itself not a fact of nature. It is just a creation of my thinking or my conceptual creation. That would be psychological. And between division, two things are different. This is different from that, but they are not divided from each other. Division is when there is some kind of like and dislike originating, a conflict originating. Like if you see a man from Africa is black and a man from Europe is white, it's just factual, or pink. But the moment you say whites are superior to the blacks, it has become racist. You have made a racist comment. That's psychological. It's not just factual.
Just can I just follow up a little bit? Yeah, sure. No, I was just going to say that to extend with respect to inside the skin and outside the skin, obviously the psychological is not, the muscles and the bones. But if you want to use that distinction inside the skin and outside the skin, it makes a little bit more clarity if you consider it from how we experience that distinction subjectively. As I experience subjectively my sense of inside the skin, there are certain things that I'm aware of. Okay, I'm not really aware of my kidneys, right? Even though they're part of the inside the skin, but I am aware of my feelings of pleasure and pain and desire, etc. Right?
So a couple of things there. One, we could become aware of things like my back feels stiff because I've been sitting here for a long time, and I'm not sure that we'd label that psychological.
No, you wouldn't.
It can
As I said, it's a
can
first
be
approximation.
Aware of,
It's just
my
a rough
heart is beating
beginning.
fast. And then in terms of pain, one would certainly be equally conscious of a pain that is the consequence of, hitting my thumb with a hammer.
That's part of
versus-
the, being aware of that is part of the psychological. Your back is not part of the psychological, but your awareness of the pain in the
I
back.
see. So you're saying that the awareness, regardless of what the stimulus is for the sensation of
It's part
pain.
of the psychological awareness, yeah. I tried to include that in the family. Awareness, observation, perception, seeing, all of those things are part of the psychological.
Okay, thanks.
In your earlier slides, you talked about oneself is revealed through relationships.
Yeah, the mirror, that's what he means, I think, by the mirror of relationship.
Yeah, and and wanting to become a good human.
That's what Job talked about.
Okay.
It's all right. It's all the same.
So this concept of relationships being a mirror
Yeah.
to becoming closer to oneself.
To observing oneself, to learning about oneself.
Yeah. Does that mean that conflict is inevitable then?
I am not sure. Help me out. Why would it mean that?
Because relationships, we relate to things, and relating to things is inevitable when it comes to being human. And so in relating to things, it will bring up conflict, because that's what the concept of mirroring is. And so I'm just asking, is conflict inevitable?
Okay, well, I wouldn't make that conclusion, because, I mean, also, you see, I'm in a funny position because I'm trying to describe what seems to me, and also I'm trying to describe the teachings of Krishnamurti. If I put it in terms of the teachings of Krishnamurti, you know, he says that where the conflict comes in is division. And if I look at myself in a mirror, in an actual physical mirror, there's no necessary division there. There's, you know, there's a certain kind of difference. There's me here and there's the mirror there, but that doesn't need to be, you know, what you would consider division. That's just two things which can be in a perfectly harmonious relationship, or there can even be a kind of oneness between them. Right, in the sense that you look at your image in the mirror, there's a certain sense in which you are that image, right? Even though it's just a physical image, you are that image. You move your head, the image moves. They're, right? They are linked together in some sense. So I don't think that relationship per se, or observation in a mirror, has to entail either division or conflict. I mean, I don't see that why it must. And I think that in Krishnamurti's terms, where conflict comes in is where there's division, which, as I've tried to say, division is not just a difference between two things, or like, you know, the Grand Canyon is a division between two pieces of land, but division comes in where something which is inherently, in and of itself, whole and undivided, when something happens to introduce a division in that, you're doing some kind of violence. You're creating something false or illusory, and that's where the process of conflict comes, at least in the teachings as I understand it. Does that make it any clearer? I'm not sure that I totally understood your question, but that's what I get from it.
Yeah, even if I was to, even when we look at our image in a mirror, I think even that is divisive, because, I mean, mirrors are something that we created, and were we even supposed to know what we look like? You know, so I just wonder if Krishnamurti kind of...
I think you can make it the basis for a division. You know, you can look at your image in the mirror and not like it, right? Or be flattered by it, what have you, and then you're setting up some kind of thing which could be divisive, but I don't see for myself that it must necessarily be that way.
But even
I don't know, what do you think? I don't want to be the only one.
I think he is just giving an analogy or a metaphor to explain that just as physically you notice what is wrong with your face or something by looking in the mirror, you can look at your consciousness inside what is going on in observing in relationship.
Yeah.
Because that's where it manifests.
That's where it manifests, yeah.
It manifests, and then you can watch yourself and learn about yourself.
Yeah.
Like you can learn about your physical appearance in a mirror. Way of speaking.
Just another way of saying the same thing, right? The division, the conflict will come up in every relationship that you have until you deal with it within yourself until it's gone. So in that way, it is inevitable.
I wanted to revisit what Krishnamurti had said about if you have no relationship with nature, how can you have relationship with human beings? And as you had mentioned earlier about his views with nature, I'm just curious. With nature, when we talk about relationship, is it different with nature because nature doesn't have concepts or thoughts or conditioning, that it's just pure consciousness? I mean, there's field of consciousness, but a lot of people experience being in nature, there's no thought. Like if they were thinking about something and they sit in nature for a while, their mind automatically clears. And so can relationship, in its truest sense of union and communion, as we work toward not having anything in between, to have that oneness with nature, that we can have oneness with everything that exists, and then relationship can fall away. And then it's just relating, opposed to relationship through concepts and schemas and archetypes. And
So I don't think I can, give a definite answer one or the other, but what I would suggest is that what you have described, as far as I understand it, sounds to me like, very possibly one element in that issue of why relationship with nature would have anything to do with relationship with human beings. It seems to me, a plausible interpretation of that situation. But the stronger thing that I think I would point to is that there's something in this which is, I think, at least the way I experience it, there's something in this which is very, very difficult to articulate. I'm not sure it's something which we can capture or put into words. I kind of think that when you are in nature and with it and absorbing it, something happens which then predisposes you in some way and enables you to interact with people in some way that you can't otherwise. That's my sense of it, and exactly how and why that comes about, I'm really not sure. There's something quite subtle, and I would dare say there might be something spiritual in it. By spiritual, I use that word in the way Bohm would have used it, which is something very, very subtle. So something subtle, he said, means finely woven. Something so subtle and kind of implicit that is very, very hard to articulate, but when it happens, you sense it in some nonverbal way, which may be very similar to what you were describing, actually.
No, on just that question of relationship with nature, I'm not sure if it is ever possible for a living human being to not have a relationship with nature. See, I'm sitting here right now. There is my interaction with the earth and with the air and everything that's around me, which will continue forever, as long as I'm alive. So I'm not sure if I understand this question that he asks, that how can you have a relationship with human beings if you don't have a relationship with nature? I don't know if that's what he really meant, or what is it that's being asked to me. It's impossible, I'm sorry at the cost of repetition, but it's impossible to not have a relationship with nature as long as we're alive. We could have, nuances of that relationship, which could be good or bad. Some people may spend more time amongst the trees in the ocean and, and all of that. And some people might not and may be more restricted to their daily lives. But that doesn't mean that there is no relationship with nature. So I'm just trying to explore this question a little bit. What is the meaning of this question? And there's just one more element to this, which is, if we could say that there is me, the individual, and then there is the environment around me, which includes nature and fellow human beings and animals and everything else, which forms a part of my external environment, right? But that, to my mind, continues all the time. It's an ongoing activity, and there is always, as a matter of fact, a relationship with the environment. So that's one thought I have, and I actually wanted to explore this question a little bit with everyone, that is it ever possible for a living human being to not have a relationship with nature?
I don't want to say categorically one way or the other. I mean, for sure, you surely have a point to some extent. Nature is, as you say, it's part of gravity. It's part of the air that we breathe. Our body itself is part of nature. So for sure, you can't eliminate that, but entirely. But on the other hand, I think the question that would arise would be, to what extent is nature, part of your consciousness or your conscious awareness? And again, I think there's something in here which is kind of implicit and something that is a little bit hard to put into words. But my relationship with gravity as I sit here and with air as I breathe it, especially when I'm paying no attention whatsoever to the gravity or to the air, I think is quite different than what, like the passage that I read where Krishnamurti is observing that tree. I think that's quite different. So to that extent, I think there is such a thing as relationship with nature, real relationship, deep relationship that goes way, way beyond just, the kind of residual thing that happens by virtue of the fact that, my kidneys are functioning and I'm breathing the air and so on.
I think you described it really well there, because there is this feeling of awe that if it is there, then it causes a cognitive shift in understanding about the whole and complete.
Yeah.
And that's where it resides, like as Krishnamurti talks about, that nature, that quality of being in nature that allows you to experience that awe, which brings a cognitive shift, with eventually, is the presence of whole and complete. And then, you kind of feel that.
Yeah.
Even if it is momentarily, we feel that. And then in that state is that there is no conflict, even if there are things, but then all conflict cease to exist, because we see even momentarily the whole and complete.
Yeah, good, thank you.
I just wanted to go back to the comment and statement. I was wondering if you could help define it or explain it, and in its broader context, what does it mean when it says there's no psychological evolution? What is meant by that?
Right. Good question. Okay, so here again we come to one of those places that we were mentioning a minute ago about the distinction between the physical and the psychological. Because, in the outer physical world, evolution is undeniable, and it's very, very important. And Krishnamurti has no problem recognizing and acknowledging that species evolve, and we evolve in the sense of learning, developing abilities, and that sort of thing. So when he says there's no psychological evolution, he's referring to, as I understand it, what is there inwardly that would evolve? Is there something within you that would evolve apart from an accumulation of knowledge? You can accumulate knowledge, but does that really change the nature of your consciousness? And he seems to be saying, as far as I understand it, that the nature and structure of your consciousness does not go through a process of what he calls becoming. This is another term that Krishnamurti often uses in this context. He says the process of becoming. He says we always want to become something more and better. We want to become wealthy. We want to become famous. We want to become secure. We want to become enlightened. We want to become President of the United States. Right? This process of becoming, which is probably, in most cases or all cases, it's an ego-driven thing, right? It's a thing which...
You mean within one lifetime?
It does.
It doesn't mean like in the last 2,000 or 3,000 years.
No, it means me, right.
Evolution, the way there has been with species, just means in the course of your life.
I think when when Krishnamurti uses this phraseology, he is, for the most part, talking about within the course of my lifetime, what I experience as an individual. I don't want to rule out, on the other hand, it's hard to try to speak for him, but my impression is that he would probably also say that over the course of centuries or millennia, mankind has also not evolved psychologically. You follow? But that's not his main point. The main point is that I, as an individual, don't go through a process of becoming something more or better, even though I think that I can and I want to, and I probably orient, a great deal of my life around the prospect of that. He says it's an illusion.
Does that mean there's no improving of one's character?
Self-improvement, right. That's what it means. It's a hard pill to swallow, right? But he's pretty emphatic about it, and he's very original because...
There's people in prison who might have different opinions, especially the ones that get out and seem not to commit those heinous crimes anymore, probably feel better about how they treat other human beings, even without any nature in prison,
So,
other than the air.
yeah, okay, so I'm sure you can find all kinds of contrary examples, and so then at that point you have to start distinguishing and refining, what exactly does he really mean by that, and why does he say this, and what about counterexamples, and I'm just trying to suggest the general...
What's more important, what he means about it or what I mean about it?
Again, this is my dilemma, whether or not I'm trying to articulate Krishnamurti's view or what is in fact the case. But for the moment, I'm just trying to articulate what I understand Krishnamurti to be saying, and I can't argue against every counterexample. I can just give you the general framework of what I understand he's trying to convey.
Respond a little bit to that. Like one thing that he would talk about, that like what is the psyche, what is the problems with the psyche is like attachment, as you would call them, or identification, or wanting to feel safe in a group. He says we are hoping that we are slowly evolving out of that within one lifetime or over a span of lifetimes. But he says it's no such thing. He says we evolve, the psyche also evolves, but it doesn't evolve towards a good human being, let's put it that way. It's definitely evolving in the sense of changing. how we were functioning maybe 10,000 years ago. We're not functioning exactly in the same way, but it's not evolving into a human being that is becoming free. Like, you know, you would say like, oh, we're slowly evolving from, well, we were very caught in our conditioning, and over generations, actually, you can measure that we're less caught in our conditioning. He would argue again.
It is possible to evolve into a more free state?
No, because that would go very much against what he would say, because that would imply that there's some kind of gradual process over time. And he said, no, there's something more related to an instantaneous change, or a complete change, a transformation. Yeah.
I was just wondering if the actual aging process of a human being might change some aspects of how they live, think, and feel
Yeah.
as they grow towards the grave.
Yeah. Well,
That might naturally.
yeah, definitely. There's that. I mean, he does mention things like that, but mostly, the older you get, you're more stuck. You know, things like that. No, I mean, it's just as blunt as that. But he has some. I mean, he's not all negative about it, but he's in general he said, well, you try to educate the young generation because there's hope there. But don't try. Sorry, that's all I want.
It's about 1 o'clock, shall we?
Anybody has the last question? Then it was me who has the last answer. So good. Then bon appetit for those who have signed up for lunch. And
So-
the lunches will be at the retreat. And
We do back at 2:30, is that what it is?
2:30 we're back. Yeah, correct. Francis, could you look on the program? 2:30, right? 2:30, yeah. Yeah, okay, good. And it's Pacific time, not Californian time. That's Thank you all.